When we think about the Mesozoic era, what often comes to mind is the variety of reptiles that once dominated the lands, seas, and skies of the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods. But these animals were far from alone, and often overlooked are the myriad of other creatures that were doing just as weird things and setting their own evolutionary records. In case you didn't already know, the earliest period in this time frame, the Triassic, had a lot of really weird things going on. So many that this channel is going to be dedicated to exploring as many of them as possible in this series. Triassic. What the f? It's March 20th, which means Happy World Frog Day. In celebration of the occasion, which started back in 2009, though by who specifically nobody seems to know, to bring attention to the diversity and conservation of the 7,300 or so known living species, today we're going to take a look at what is currently recognized as the first froggy friend from the fossil record, which just so happens to hail from the right time period to be included in this series. Unfortunately, before we can get to the frog itself, there's a little bit of backstory to wade through. Like many paleontological discoveries, this one has its origins in the European colonial era of the 19th and early 20th centuries, specifically the island of Madagascar in the early to mid-1930s, which at the time was occupied by the French. The exact story of the fossil's discovery is unclear, though it's known that it was not actually dug up on site as you might imagine. Some reports of albeit dubious validity mention that it was actually found in the hut of the chief of the village of Betsieka, and was either gifted to or collected by amateur French paleontologist Adrien Massenot, though it's also possible and generally accepted that Massenot just came upon it while walking around near the village in a region known as the Ambilobe Basin. However he acquired it, Massenot eventually passed the fossil along to a more experienced and famous French paleontologist, Jean Pivotot, who was working at the French National Museum of Natural History in Paris, where the fossil remains to this day. This somewhat complicated story doesn't quite end there, because now we get into everyone's favorite topic in biology, taxonomic nomenclature. For some reason, although he could readily identify the fossil as that of a new and unique species of early frog, Pivotot named the animal in parts, giving it the genus name Protobatrachus in his first description in May of 1936, and later adding the species name Massenoti in a separate paper published that November. Why he did this is unclear as far as I could find, but in between his two publications, a German researcher named Oskar Kuhn, who was seemingly unaware of Pivotot's work on the fossil, started working on his own type description of the frog, and because traditional scientific naming practices often lean to some pretty predictable themes, he too named the animal Protobatrachus massenoti, although his paper didn't get published until 1938. Because he feared some issue regarding the taxon's validity might arise from having two independent researchers both staking claims to giving the same organism the same name, Kuhn would later go on to rename the frog as Triodobatrachus massenoti in 1962, even though the name Protobatrachus had been in use for over 20 years at that point. Whether this change was actually merited is unknown to me, and frankly isn't really all that important, but at least now you know why you often get Protobatrachus as a search result when you look for Triodobatrachus, even in works published as recently as the 1980s. With all of that out of the way, we can finally get to the fossil itself, which is plenty interesting in its own right. At first glance, it appears remarkably complete, preserving the remains of a frog about 10 centimeters long from nose to tail, missing only the hands and feet, as well as the foremost part of the snout. Even the outline of the body is clearly visible as a halo around the skeleton. However, a closer look reveals that there's actually nothing physically there. The skeleton itself had decomposed and disappeared during the fossilization process, leaving behind a three-dimensional impression in the top and bottom halves of the surrounding rock, the whole of which is called a nodule or concretion. This type of preservation commonly occurs in soft sedimentary rock, which means that the environment the animal died in was, unsurprisingly if you're familiar with frogs, an aquatic one, likely the bed of one of the many ponds or streams that dotted this wooded wetland area some 250 million years ago during the late Induan or early Olenekian stage of the early Triassic. At the time, Madagascar was just another part of the contiguous supercontinent Pangaea, sandwiched between what would become Africa to its northwest and the Indian subcontinent to its southeast, putting the now fossil formation Trilobatrachus comes from, the Sacamena group, near the coast. Despite not actually bearing any proper bony fossils, multiple successive studies have been able to examine the features of Trilobatrachus' skeletal anatomy to reveal how this first frog made its way around its environment and its place among the amphibian family tree. This was initially done by creating skeletal casts, using the two halves of the fossil as individual molds, and pouring the casting material, usually plaster, sometimes clay or some other material, into them. The plaster or whatever else would fill in the gaps in the rock left behind by the skeleton and eventually harden, taking on the shape of the bones. The completed casts would then be removed and painted for good measure. Most studies on Trilobitrachus anatomy have been based on these casts. More recently, though, a study published in 2016 by then PhD candidate Eduardo Askeruns and colleagues used CT scanning to peer inside the fossil itself, creating a full digital 3D rendering of the skeleton based on the openings in the rock, including some details hiding within the individual halves of the nodule, and thus not seen in the casts. While Trilobitrachus is recognizably a frog and bears some of the technical froggy features like the shape of its ilium, a toothless lower jaw, and the fusion of the frontal and parietal bones in its skull into a single structure creatively called the frontoparietal, it's clear that many of its other features, which we'll get to momentarily, are not quite as specialized as those in its later relatives. This places Trilobitrachus as the basalmost member of the overall frog family, aka the Salientians, just outside of the main clade that includes all the anatomically modern frogs, the Anurans, the earliest known of which come from the early Jurassic. Additionally, its geologic age places it as the earliest known batrachian, the clade that includes both frogs and salamanders, and depending on the familial identity of some possible Permian age relatives, might also be the earliest known Lysamphibian, the group that encompasses all currently extant amphibians, and an extinct salamander-like branch more closely related to them than anything else. If you thought that was a lot, just wait until I get to talking about where frogs fit into the overall amphibian family tree, which is a very complicated and contentious subject that's much better suited for its own video. While I'm on this aside, I should mention that toads aren't a separate group from frogs, or even a proper subgroup within Anura. It's just a general non-scientific term that applies to any frog with drier, more warty skin and lower dependence on watery habitats. But not all animals called toads are actually more closely related to each other than they are to other frogs. The toad characteristics are just widespread across multiple families. You might hear of the Bufonidae family specifically referred to as the true toads, but even some species in that family are commonly referred to as frogs. As for what makes Trilobitrachus merely a proto-frog, if you will, there are a number of features that represent the gulf between modern frogs and their pre-Lysamphibian ancestors. One of the most obvious is the proportionately short legs paired against a relatively long body. Unlike modern frogs, which only have at most 9 presacral vertebrae, Trilobitrachus has 15 of them. Additionally, the first two neck bones, technically called the atlas and axis, each have a unique shape to help move the head around, whereas modern frogs lack this morphological differentiation. This might mean that Trilobitrachus had a bit more head mobility than modern frogs, and may have been more laterally flexible as well, though it still had a relatively stout build, and so probably wasn't as bendy as a salamander. Arguably the biggest reason for keeping Trilobitrachus out of the true frog club is its presumed inability to jump, something most frogs are of course quite good at. Clearly this is not a very leggy animal, and so as you might have guessed from just eyeballing the limb proportions, Trilobitrachus wasn't much of a hoppy boy. But if intuition wasn't enough for you, the aforementioned 2016 study did some quick maths to back it up. Askeruns and colleagues looked at previous work that measured how hind limb length affects jumping performance in frogs and small lizards. Using two different metrics, the ratio of the lengths of the femur and tibiofibrilla to each other, and their combined length compared to the length of the head and body, Askeruns and colleagues determined that if Trilobitrachus were physically able to jump, it would be considered a weak generalist jumper, though the lack of fusion in both its lower limbs and hips, as well as the more sprawled salamander-like orientation of the hind limbs and lack of shock-absorbent forelimbs likely precluded any remaining habitual jumping potential. Furthermore, another 2016 study went even deeper into the math to evaluate the evolution of different locomotion styles in frogs based on limb proportions, hip structure, and spinal cord length, with a focus on Trilobitrachus and comparisons to salamanders and lizards for good measure. This study also found Trilobitrachus to be more similar to salamanders than frogs in this respect, making it pretty safe to assume that these guys were mostly just crawling around at various speeds and rarely, if ever, attempted to catch air. This limited land mobility means that Trilobitrachus may have relied on camouflage, noise, or even toxins secreted in its skin to prevent ending up in other animals' stomachs, all of which are strategies seen throughout modern frogs and salamanders. Some species even combine multiple anti-predator strategies. Simply escaping into water might have also been a perfectly viable strategy for fleeing land-based threats. We know amphibians generally have fairly close lifelong ties to water, and there's little reason to assume otherwise for Trilobatrachus. Likewise, being able to move between environments probably came in handy if any river denizens got interested in some Triassic Quistigwinui. As for their own eating habits, it's not unlikely that Trilobatrachus was targeting small, slow-moving invertebrates, or even lying in ambush to snag creatures that got close enough to be grabbed by either its hands or short tongue, which seems to have lacked the bones necessary for the specialized, long-distance, sticky spearing seen in some frogs. It is worth noting, and also very amusing, that some modern frogs actually lack tongues altogether and just stuff prey into their mouths with their hands. Frogs, likely including Trilobatrachus as well, can also retract their proportionately large eyeballs into their skull to help them push food down their throats. I'll give you a second to let that digest as you watch this frog finish its meal. There's one further feature seen in Trilobatrachus that seems to be reflective of its basal status, which you may have also noticed by now: a tail. Unlike modern frogs, including the primitive North American tailed frogs whose tail is just an extension of the male cloaca, Trilobatrachus had an unfused tail comprising of at least 10 vertebrae. In modern frogs, the tail is reduced to a coccyx-like structure called a urostyle that sits in line with their elongated hips and generally doesn't project beyond them. Even in tadpoles, their tails are boneless and lack vertebrae, only stiffened by a detachable notochord. With a sample size of only 1 for now, it can't be said for sure whether the tail seen in this Trilobatrachus individual was a result of its incomplete ontogeny and might have shrunken as it was resorbed, or if this was in fact its full adult form, though the latter seems more likely based on presumed patterns of bone fusion throughout other parts of the skeleton that suggest that it was approaching skeletal maturity. What this structure actually looked like is also an open question. Despite its prevalence in paleoartistic reconstructions, including every single illustration used in this video, Askeruns, whose study actually discovered the full bony extent of the tail via CT scanning, actually has doubts about whether it would have even been externally visible in life.
What I'd say is that maybe it had an externally visible tail. If it did, it was short, and we have no direct evidence of it. It is plausible, but there's no direct evidence of it, in my opinion. But internally, yes, we do have this very different condition from what we see in modern Anurans.
Altogether, Trilobatrachus represents a crucial, and ironically the most complete, piece in the puzzle that is early frog evolution, and indeed the whole of the history of Lys amphibians, filling in an otherwise nearly 90 million year gap between modern amphibians and their Permian ancestors, whatever they are. Whether it proves to be directly ancestral to modern frogs, or was just an offshoot of an early batch, it's worth appreciating and protecting the unique evolutionary legacy it helped to leave behind. So many species today play important roles in conservation efforts as ecological indicators of the state of our environments, and as their populations continue to suffer a decades-long crash due to a variety of largely human-induced factors related to climate change, environmental pollution, and habitat destruction, it's becoming more crucial than ever to heed their warnings. So be kind and gentle to the frogs of our world. They've survived over 250 million years of Earth history, and have made their mark on human cultures for thousands of years. It'd be a shame if they were wiped out by our species' actions in the geologic blink of an eye. Fortunately, some conservation efforts are seeing a measure of success, and hopefully we'll see more of such measures in the near future to help protect all of the world's fascinating frogs from joining the ranks of their ancient ancestors. Being able to move between environments probably came in handy if any river denizens got interested in some Triassic Quissi de Grenot. Quissi de Grenot, haha. No. Quissi de Grenot. Quissi de Grenot. Grenouille? Quissi de Grenouille. I don't know what that word is.